Welcome to Flutter Teacher. In this session, we'll talk about getters and setters in the Dart. Before I start the video, let's look at a topic that we'll cover in this session. We'll start from the basics of getter and setter. Then I will talk about the different use of getters and setters in the program. And finally, I will talk about different queries, that is, your doubts and difficulties regarding the getters and setter. You might call this one as the tips from my side to you guys. So without wasting time, let's get started. Let's understand what a getter and the setter is. Basically, getter and setter are the special methods that provide explicit read and write access to object properties. It means using getter, it's possible for you to read the value of a particular field and to write the value or to change the value of a particular field. Now you might say that whenever we create a class, we have fields, and if we have a public field, we can directly change or we can directly access the value of that particular field. Yes, it's true. And that particular concept or that particular thing is called as the implicit getter and setter. So whenever we have a class that contains public field, so each and every public field in a class has the implicit getter and setter for it. But consider that the implicit setter and getters are not enough for you, and you want to use the explicit getter and setter for that particular field. Then in this case, Dart has given two different keywords for you, the get and set, to define the getter and setters respectively. Now let me explain in brief what basically getter is. Getter is a method that reads the value of field and it is called as the accessor. Whereas a setter is a method that updates the value of field and acts as the mutator. So if you have any program experience or if you know about any object-oriented programming, you might have heard about this term called accessor and the mutator. So for those who don't know about what is, let me explain in brief. Accessor is a method that only access the value of field. Means using that method, we can just read the value, but we cannot change the value of something. On the other hand, mutator is a method that always has to update or change the value of something. It never reads the value for you. Now let's understand this getters and setters practically. You can observe here we have a class called person that contains two public field, name and age. This one is the constructor where I'm getting the value of name and age. So you can observe here as this name and age are the public field. Inside the main or inside the any library wherever I'm creating the object of this person, I can happily write, let's say p dot age is equals to some value, let's say 25. So it's possible. So whenever we write this p dot age equals to some value, we're actually changing the value of this age. In this case, we are using the implicit setter for this age. And let's say when I write say print p dot age. So in this case, as I'm printing the value of this age, it means I'm accessing the value of this age. So in this case, I'm calling the implicit getter related to the field called age. So as these are the public field, it's possible for us to use the implicit getters and implicit setters associated with them. In this specific video, I'm not going to talk about the implicit getters and setter, whereas we want to focus on the explicit getters and setter. For this, I need to make some changes. So let me delete this tool from here and let me make this as a private. I need to change the private again for the age, and I need to make the changes accordingly in the constructor. So I'm done here. Now let me explain properly or in detail what basically the getter is. So as we know that getter is some method that allows us to read the value. But technically what basically the getter is. Getter is a special method that takes no parameter and can be called, means we always call that method without an explicit argument list. The getter method is always preceded, that is, it is always defined using the keyword called get, and it cannot have any parameter list, not even empty when we define the method. So consider that we have the field called is age, and for this field age, I want to define the getter here. So first of all, I need to use the keyword called get. So without using this get, we cannot define a getter in the Dart. So let's use the get here. Then I'm using the age here. Now what is this basically age? Age is the name of the getter that I want to define, and it cannot have this bracket, means we cannot write this one. So if you write this particular thing, that is the opening and closing a pair of parentheses here, so it's completely invalid because getter cannot have the parameter list, not even empty. So I need to remove this one from here, and from this age I just want to return the value of this underscore age. So I can simply write here, let's say return the underscore age, and that's going to be fine. So as I'm returning value of this underscore age, and as it is of kind integer, I can simply write here int, and that's gonna fine. Now you can observe here, this getter has got a single line of code. That's why I can happily change it to the fiat arrow notation. So let me remove this bracket from here and from here as well. And I can change it to say this fiat arrow symbol and delete this return keyword from here, and that's completely fine. Now let me talk it again here. So basically when we write get here, it means we are defining a getter, and name of my getter is a age, and you can observe here inside this age, that is from this getter, I'm simply returning the value of this age here, and as this underscore age is a kind of integer variable, I have return type in the form of integer. Now lots of student has a doubt that is it compulsory to have a single line of code in the getter or just to have always the fiat arrow notation for the getter? I will say no, it's not at all the case. It depends on what code or what logic you have inside the getter. It means if you have some complex thing inside the getter, then definitely you need to have the body for this getter, and in that case, it may not be the fiat arrow notation or fiat arrow function for you. Now, when we call this getter, so make sure that when we write this getter, that is, let's say if I'm writing p.age, so when we write this p.age means basically I'm calling a getter over this object for the field called age. Now you can observe here, this age is basically a method. Of course, it's a getter method, but you can observe here, while calling this age on line number 15, we don't have this opening and closing parenthesis. This is because while calling a getter, we don't need to pass this opening and closing parenthesis, so that we can have a feeling of getter just to use as a property and not to call like a method. You might have doubt, what if I put the brackets here to define or to call this age? So if I put the bracket, you can see we are getting error here. Let me show the error. It says that we cannot have a bracket here. Even if you try to put bracket for here, that is to define this getter age, again you can see you will have error here. Let me show some here. You can see in line number 7 we're getting the error. So make sure that while defining a getter and also while calling a getter, we should not use the brackets. Now let me explain practically what the setter is. We know that a setter is something, or setter is some method that allows us to change the value of a particular field. But basically a setter is a special method that takes exactly one parameter and does not return any value. Means while defining a setter, we cannot write the return type for that one. We can write a void, or we have to ignore that one. In most of the cases, we ignore because the Dart suggests don't write void as return type for the setter. We have to ignore that one. And in order to define the setter method, we always have to use the keyword called set. And now you might have doubt that how Dart identifies whether to call a setter or getter. Let me explain this one here. Let's say I want to define a setter for the age, so I can write a set, and let me define the age. Now, what is basically this age is? Age is the name of setter that I want to define here. And as I told you that there must be a single parameter in the setter, so let me define a method here, and I want to accept the value in the form of int, so I can write int its value, and whatever value that I have received, so I want to pass this value to age, so I can write here underscore age is equals to the value, and that's completely fine for you. Now again you can observe here, this setter has a single line of code. I can change it to say fiat annotation, so let me delete this bracket from here and from here as well, and let me write this fiat arrow symbol, that's completely fine. Now let me again explain here. So the age is a name of setter, and setter must have exactly one parameter. So if you try to omit the parameter, you will have the error, or if you try to pass multiple parameters, even you can have the errors. And you can observe here inside the setter, I'm changing the value of age. So whatever value we are passing in the setter, I'm passing that value to the age. So if you want, we can write return type as a void. But if I write the void, immediately Dartpad will give me suggestion that we should not use void here. It says that it says avoid return type for the setter. So it's recommended to don't have means not to have any return type for the setter. That's gonna fine. Now the question that I ask you is that you can observe here the name of my setter is age, and again the name of my getter is age. So is it valid? Yeah, it's completely valid. Means we can have the same name for setter and same name for getter. So as I have defined age as a getter and age as a setter, now I cannot define another getter and another setter with the same name age. Now let me answer how Dart understand whether to call a setter or getter because they have the same name. Let's say if I write here say p.age and is equals to 25. Now just observe here, When I'm writing age is equals to mean I'm using a setter or getter whatever it is, and we are trying to assign the value. So at this time your dart understand that you are not doing some accessing activity, you are doing the activity to update the value. Means you have some value and you want to update, so immediately it will call the setter and not the getter. This value 25 will be assigned inside this value variable, and that will change the value of your underscore age variable. However, when we use this p.age, in this case, we are not trying to assign a value inside this one. That's the reason Dart understand it is just activity of reading or accessing some value. So it will happily call the getter. And when I run this program, you can observe here, due to line number 15, the value of age will change to 25. And when finally I print it, I will get 25 on the console. Let's understand the practical use of getters and setters. This is the most common question asked by various students to me, that by default we have the implicit getters and setters in the Dart. Then why someone should define explicit getters and setters? So as per my knowledge, means as per my experience, I have seen four different situations or four different uses of the getters and setters that makes means that really makes a sense for us. The first is to have validating input for the field. We have a class called student, and that contains two fields, name and age. Now consider the name and age are the public, which means we have the implicit getter and setter for this one. So if I want to pass the value for age, so I can directly write in the main or in any of the library, I can directly write say some object name, that is s.age equals to some value. So there are no rules or restriction that what is the filtration or what is the regulations over the value, because I'm just having the implicit getter and setter. But if I want to have some control over the values, I want to have some checking over the values. If some value is having some formalities, or it is having some rules and regulations, then only value has to be assigned. Otherwise, that value has to be skipped. So in order to define that one, we must have explicit setter or getter, and that's what I am explaining here. You can observe here, we have a simple getter here over the age, and that's fine. You can observe here inside this setter, that is the age, I'm getting the value and I'm checking that if the value is greater than 0, means if it is a valid value for age, it should not be the negative value. Then and then only I'm assigning it to the age. Otherwise, I'm simply printing a message that age cannot be negative. And this is the simple method show data that prints the value of name and age on the console. And in the main, you can observe here I have the object with the value of name as same and the age as 21. So here in line number 25, I'm trying to assign the negative value, and I'm calling the show data, and again I'm trying to assign some proper value, that is value 25, and I'm calling it show data. So let me run this program here. You can observe here as I'm calling this age as a value with minus. You can observe here in line number 26, when I'm calling show data, it is saying me that the age cannot be negative. And okay, this is basically a message I'm getting for this setter. And when I'm calling show data, it is giving me the exactly old value, that is the 21. You can observe here the value isn't changed here. And when I'm using s.25, that is s.age equals to 25, the value has changed to 25, and the name is as it is, of course. The second common use of getters and setter is seen when we have the getters or setter to perform some calculation based values. We know that if we have the implicit getters and setters, we have to assign the normal values, means we cannot have some calculations and then assign the value. So if you want to do that particular task, definitely we should go with the explicit setters and getters. Let me explain this one again with an example. We have a class called employee that contains the name and the joining date. Now you can observe here inside the constructor I'm passing the value of name and the joining date in the form of date and time. Okay, in line number 50 we have this employee, and I'm passing the value of name as employee the same, and the date is I'm passing here 18th of June and 2022. Now you can observe here I have a getter, and this name of the getter is days of work. It is basically a getter that is working on the joining date, which is exactly giving me the number of days he has worked from his current joining date. So this video is being recorded on the 23rd of the June. So what I'm doing here, I'm just returning the days difference, that is the number of days between his joining date and the current date, that is of course the 23rd of June 2022. So I'm writing here return date time dot now, and the difference I'm calling the method difference. So I'm passing here joining date and I'm converting the date. So when I run this, you can observe here as it is the 23rd, and the date of joining is the 18th of June. So there are total 6 number of days the Sam has worked in this particular company. The most common and most widest use of setter and getter that I have seen is to make the fields read only. This is basically the most common use of the getters, not the setter. Let me talk about some problem before I explain this example. Consider a class is having the public field. So as it is a public, anybody can modify or anybody can read that one. So there is no chance to make it read only. And if you make a field private, so nobody can access it, nobody can modify that one. It means there is no option to play with that particular field. So this is the best situation where we can have the advantage of getter to make our field as the read only. We have the class test that contains the underscore x as the private field. So it is as it is private, it cannot be accessed outside this library, means it's secure. So, but I want to make this one as the read only, means anybody can read the value, but it cannot be changed. So for that, what I have defined, I have the getter and the name of getter is x. And from this getter, I'm simply returning the value of x here. You can observe in the main, I have the object in the form of obj in line number 10. And in line number 11, I can call say ob.x. So whenever we use this ob.x, it is basically a getter that is invoked over this underscore x. And when I run this, you can observe here I'm getting the value of x as a 10 on the console. The fourth use of getters and setter is for the programmer's convenience. It means if we define the getters and setter as the Dart suggests, it makes our code more clear and simple to perform operations over the object. On the other hand, if you're the person who have some other programming experience like say Java or C Sharp, there we have to define the normal method and we call those methods as the getters and setter. So instead of invoking a method on an object, it's more convenient and it makes our code more clear if we use the getters and setter using this get and the set keywords. Let's cover a very important point of this video and this is basically the queries or doubts from you guys. So the first question that is being asked that why Dart has given explicit getters and setters. You know that by default we have the implicit getters and setters if we have the public fields. So why Dart has given explicit getters and setters? You know, the one important thing is if we have a class and inside this class by using the normal methods we can define the getter and we can define the setter, means like what we define in case of other programming languages. That's completely fine, but you know there is one drawback. Means let's say if we define the getter, so there is no guarantee or there is no option that a programmer can't have no parameter function or no parameter method. Means he can define the parameters if he want, or while defining a setter he may not accept the parameter because he is writing the code and he's of course the boss of that code. But if we use the explicit getters and setter using the get and set given by the Dart, so you're forced that your getter should not have a parameter and your setter should have exactly one parameter. And moreover, if you ask me that what is the basic reason that has given? So we have right now seen there are four basic reasons why the Dart suggests or why Dart has this explicit getter and setter. The first one is to have validation for input values. Second, to make your fields read-only. And third one, to have some calculation-based concept or some calculation-based methods when we are setting the value or when we are getting the value of your fields. And the fourth one, it makes your code more clear and simple to perform operations over the object. The second doubt which is commonly asked is what is the default return type of getter? It means if I'm not defining return type for the getter, what is the default return type of this one? Let's understand this one practically. We have a class called person that has two fields underscore name and underscore age in the form of the private fields. Then we have a constructor that gets the value for that one, and we have a getter for this one. So let me click on the getter called age. So as I click here, you can observe here documentation says that the return type of this get is by default dynamic. So make sure that whenever we define any getter, the default return type of that getter is dynamic if you are not specifying it explicitly. So let me show you some error in this program. When I tap, you can see return type of this getter age is a dynamic and which is not a subtype of this particular int here. This is because you can observe here, I'm just trying to use this one here and inside the program. That's why I'm getting error here. So this has to be changed, means I need to write here say int, and I can observe here this particular error will disappear from my code. So make sure that by default every getter has the dynamic as return type. So if you want or if you need, you have to change it to your specific type. Now what about the return type of setters? Basically, as per the rule in Dart, we cannot return anything from the setter. That's why if I try to write say int for the setter, you can observe here Dartpad will give me error that it's not allowed to have return type for the setter. And let's say if I write void here, again the Dartpad suggests me that I should not write void for the return type. So it's always recommended that you should not write the return type for setter. So make sure that there should not be a return type for setter, and we cannot return any value from the setters. What about the parameters in getter and setter? As per the rule in Dart, we cannot write any parameter for the getter. It means when we define a getter, we cannot even write opening and closing parentheses for the getter. So it has to be ignored or it has to be removed. That's what we have seen in this video itself. And whenever we call that particular getter, we cannot pass a value to that specific field or to that specific variable. And when we define a setter, it's compulsory for us to have exactly one parameter for the setter. Means we cannot have zero parameter or we cannot have more than one parameters for the setter. Can we have different data types for getter and setter than the field type? In most of the cases, we never do this thing actually. But in rare cases, if it requires, means if your value is based on some calculation or there is some logic that has to be performed and that is resulting into different type rather than the type of your field, then it's definitely possible and you can define that kind of getter and setter. Okay, we already seen that example here. Let me show it again to you. You can observe here we have the getter and the name of getter is the days of work. You can observe here this getter is basically working over the joining date. Joining date is a type of date time, but for this getter we have the return type in the form of integer. And this proves that it's possible to have the getters or even a setter to have different type and the type of field. How many getters and setters are allowed for one field? Practically, it's possible to define multiple getters and setters for the single field. But actually we don't need this one. But there might be a rare cases. Just look at this example here. We have a class called rectangle that contains two fields, the length and breadth. This is what a constructor that gets the value of length and breadth here. You can observe here I have defined two getters here, but the magical thing is these getters are not for getting the value of length and breadth. These are doing some calculations here. You can observe here we have the getter in the form of area. This is the getter with the name area that returns the area using the formula length into breadth. And we have another getter called perimeter that returning the perimeter of this particular rectangle using some formula. You can observe here both this getter area and perimeter they are operating on the length and breadth here. So it proves that for a particular field we can have multiple getters, even we can have multiple setters. The most common question that is being asked is the impact of performance for the getters and setter compared to the normal methods. Most of the programmers say that we are from the another background, means we don't know the Dart, and we are comfortable with just defining the normal methods, let's say get data, set data, and so on. So what is the impact of that one on the performance? So as per my knowledge, there is no impact on performance. Means it will have the same performance if you're using the getters and setters suggested by the Dart, or if you don't like that one, if you want to go with whatever knowledge or whatever concept that you feel comfortable with, that is with your traditional methods to define getter and setter. So there is no problem, of course, for the performance point of view. Now, finally, let me talk about do's and don'ts in the getters and setter. We have a class called student and that contains a public field called name, and over this name we have the getter and setter. You can observe here from this getter I'm simply returning the value of name, and using this setter I'm simply assigning the value to name. Means I'm not doing any calculation based operations, I'm simply just getting and setting the values. So this type of class or this type of getters and setters are not recommended. This is because as we have public field, it can be accessed, means we can modify or we can even access the value. So as your task is just to get and set the normal values. So don't use this kind of getters and setter. Just delete it. Let's look at a second example. Inside the class student, we have the private field underscore name, and just to access this field we have getter, and to modify the field we have the setter called name. So again, this type of setters and getters are not at all recommended. This is because I'm just assigning the value in setter and I'm just reading the value in the getter. So if I have this private field, means I feel that it's a private and it's getting secure. But these getters and setters, they are losing a security of this particular private fields. Means there is no impact having this one as a private. So that's why this type of setters and getters are not recommended. Yeah, if you're doing some calculations and then we have some setters and getters, then it's completely fine. But if you have only the normal setting and getting of values, then it's not at all recommended. Now you might have a question, then what are the situations where these getters and setters are recommended? We already seen this topic in the use of getters and setters. So let me just list out once for you. So it is recommended that if we have the getters and setters to perform some validation for input, then happily we can write the getters and setter. When we want to make our field, that is the private field, read only, go ahead with the getters. Then if we want to perform some calculation based values or some calculation based operations, then simply we can go with getters and setters. That's completely fine. And finally, if you want to make your code to be cleaner and much more simple to perform operations, then in that case also we can define the getters and setters. That's it for this video. See you guys in the next video. If you really like the way I explain the concept, then don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell notification button to get my latest videos.